Chapter 13. Hearthlight. The snow that had made the station feel like a soft dream did not last long on the lanes of Waverly Bay, and by the last morning of the year it had settled into small white shadows along fences and in the quiet corners of gardens where sun did not travel, leaving the air clear and the roofs clean and the paths easy underfoot. After the late arrival and the wordless embrace that ended a week of letters, Aiden slept in a little and woke with the feeling that a door inside him had closed gently on a draft, not to shut anything out, only to keep what mattered warm. The cutting on his windowsill drifted in the jar where he had set it before leaving for the city, and the roots looked a little thicker, as if they had grown during his absence out of a sense of loyalty. He said good morning to it, and to the pencil he had promised to bring back and had left beside the sketchbook, and to the small ribbon Mira had slipped around his wrist when they climbed the hill in the snow and unlocked the greenhouse. A ribbon the color of seagrass that still held the faintest trace of lavender. He brewed tea and held the cup with both hands and let the room return to him. When he lifted the blind, the sea lay flat and pale, with a seam of bright light where the sky touched it, and gulls drifted at a slow pace that made even their wings look like patient thoughts. The market would be quieter today, only a handful of stalls near the square, but the cafe would be open and the lantern on the shelf would wait for evening. He wrote a small note to leave on the cafe board that said, "Tonight we will cook at the greenhouse and light our lantern to begin the year. All welcome in heart if not in feet." And he drew a tiny square of blue again because he liked the way the color settled a sentence. After he wrapped his scarf and stepped into the lane, he noticed how the cold made everything sound close. Footsteps felt recognizable even when out of sight. A door closed and he could tell the weight of it from the sound. The bell on the cafe door lifted a clear tone that brought the room to meet him. The fern near the window had learned a new lean since winter began, a slow bow toward the light that changed the shape of its shadow on the wall. The owner raised a hand and poured tea before he asked. He pinned his card to the board and stood a moment reading the notes neighbors had left during the week. Little thank yous for the station heater and the quiet way the attendant had shared tea. A drawing of a mitten with a heart inside it. A short line that said, "The lantern in the window made my daughter brave." When he turned, he saw Mira at the far table with a notebook open and a small bundle of herbs tied with string beside her plate. She looked up as if she had felt him cross the threshold and smiled with the calm kind of welcome that settles a room without effort. They greeted each other softly and sat. They both spoke at once and then laughed and let the space choose who would go first. He told her about the street in the city that had held the last snow of the morning and how a man with a broom had left the smallest drift near a shop because the drift looked like a sleeping cat. She told him about the greenhouse night after the embrace at the station, how the glass had held the moon tea pail, how she had set the letters in a neat line like stones along a stream, and how the kettle had made a sound that was not quite a song and not quite a sigh, only the room telling them it was glad. They planned the evening with simple steps that turned a thought into a day. They would meet at the market stalls for bread, cheese, and a basket of wintergreens, then climb the hill and set the lantern frame on the table and finish only what felt ready. He would bring his pot with the heavy bottom that liked to slow a boil. She would bring her small jar of saffron threads, a gift from the spice stall after the woman heard about the clock tower night, and they would make a gentle stew that leaned toward the sea without asking it to do any work. They finished their cups and stood near the shelf to visit the market lantern. The blue pane caught a pale wash of morning and held it like a memory of summer water. A small card sat beside it in the owner's careful hand that read "Light found together," and below, 3 dots drawn by a child formed a small pyramid that meant something plain and perfect. When they walked out, the day had shifted into the clean brightness that follows cold, and the square looked like a canvas washed and set to dry. The bread stall offered loaves with crusts the color of old wood and interiors that would steam if cut too soon. The cheese seller had set out a small wheel that smelled like a pasture after rain. The greenhouse stood with a thin salt dust on its panes and a faint whistle at one seam where wind tested the joinery and then moved along. Inside, the temperature turned from strict to friendly in 3 steps, as if someone had reached out and placed a shawl around their shoulders. They set the basket on the bench and arranged the letters along the windowsill as if guests had come to watch. The lantern frame waited like a patient instrument. The pale aqua piece that they had hung the night before swung once when the door closed and then settled, the bubble inside it brightening whenever a cloud passed and let a little more light in. Aiden placed the pot on the small burner and poured oil into it in a thin thread that caught the light and turned gold at once. Mira washed the greens in a tub of clear water that looked like winter glass and shook the leaves gently so droplets rolled down like beads. They worked quietly at first because hands often set the tone before voices do. Knife on board. Spoon on pot. The soft thump of a heel against the floor when a person reaches a high shelf. He cut onions slow so they would offer sweetness rather than insistence. She peeled a few small potatoes with the kind of care that leaves as much as possible in place. He added garlic and rosemary to the warm base and waited for the first hint of the right smell, then turned down the flame so the room could stay calm. She took the saffron jar from her bag and lifted the lid with a reverent motion that made him think of the way she lowered a plant into new soil. And she let 3 threads fall into a cup with warm water so the color could wander before joining the pot. They spoke in the low voices that come after work that has earned its quiet. She told him about the boy with the red mittens who had counted lamps in the station and fallen asleep with his face turned toward the glass. He told her about the woman on the train who had embroidered a green leaf and then folded her hands over it as if keeping it alive with warmth. She told him the owner of the cafe had found a note slipped under the door that morning that said, "Thank you for saving a seat for people who do not know where they are going." He told her about the student who had wanted to call her grandmother because of a drawing of 2 cups, and he said he hoped the call had been made and that the cups in that house were warm. The stew learned patience, and the saffron turned the broth into a light that could be eaten. He added a bit of sea salt and a small handful of herbs, and she tore the greens into the pot at the right moment so they softened without losing their shape. He cut slices from the loaf and set them on a tray, then brushed them with a little oil and warmed them on the back of the stove. The greenhouse smelled like comfort and something new, the way a kitchen smells when people who have come home are cooking for the first time since a journey. They ate with bowls held in their hands, standing for the first few spoonfuls because the warmth felt good against their palms, then sitting side by side on the bench with their shoulders touching and their eyes moving across the glass to the hill where the town lay in a soft blue hush. They did not talk about the year that was closing in any grand way. Aiden said that he liked how the market had been a teacher and the clock tower a kind of choir and the library a room that knew what to say without words. Mira said that the greenhouse had taught her to notice small hours and that the cafe board had become the town's way of speaking to itself. And she said that when she thought of the letters pressed with lavender, she felt as if they had laid a path that the two of them could find even in a storm. When they finished, he set the bowls in the sink and let the water run slowly while she cleared the bench. They saved a bowl on the windowsill for the owner who would pass on her way home and for the attendant if he came by after closing. And they left the spoon inside so the steam would rise and scent the panes. The light thinned into the pale silver that belongs only to winter afternoons that move toward evening without drama. Aiden stood and looked at the lantern frame with its single piece and the empty places where the rest would live. Mira lifted a small parcel from a drawer, a paper bundle tied with twine, and placed it on the table. Inside lay 3 pieces of glass they had chosen during the earlier months. One clear as the inside of a shell, one soft green with a tiny swirl at the edge, and one white like sea foam that had decided to keep its shape. They considered them as they would consider new neighbors. The clear piece asked for the top to let the last light pass through at day's end. The green asked for the side near the rosemary because color likes to be near scent. The white asked to be placed low where it could catch the flame's small breath and send it back as a quiet wave. They worked slowly with their hands close together, measuring not with numbers but with the eyes that had learned each other's habits. He held while she marked with the pencil he had brought from the city. She drilled with a tool that hummed like a small bee, steady and careful, then sanded each hole until the edges told her they would not bite the string. He tied knots that would not slip and would not shout. She lifted the frame and let each piece find its movement. They stopped twice to make tea because tea turns a task into a conversation. They opened the greenhouse door once to let in the smell of the hill and the quick breath of air that the body remembers as a way to reset. By the time dusk met evening, the lantern held 4 pieces and no more, and it felt complete in that way things do when they have not reached perfect but have reached true. Now they prepared the hearthlight. They had decided without saying so that they would light both lanterns tonight. The market lantern in the cafe window where it lived and the greenhouse lantern where it had been made. They wrapped the greenhouse lantern in a scarf for the walk down the hill and checked the knots once more. Mira slipped a small folded card into her pocket with a line she had written earlier, and Aiden put the honey jar into his bag and tucked the spoon beside it because he had an idea for later. The evening opened like a calm book as they stepped outside. The sky over the sea carried a bright thread where the sun had been, and the first stars appeared in the cold, sharp way they do when the season is honest. The path down smelled like cedar and smoke and the clean metal scent of frost. In the square, the cafe door stood open for a moment to let out a wash of warmth and laughter before it closed again. The owner met them at the shelf with a smile that made everyone else in the room smile, the kind of echo only human faces can make. They set the greenhouse lantern on a small table near the fern and the market lantern on its shelf. And even standing next to each other, the two lights felt like separate friends. The owner brought a safe candle and a match, and Aiden nodded to Mira, and Mira nodded back to Aiden, and they both looked at the room, which had gone a little quieter without knowing it. He lit the candle for the greenhouse lantern, and she lit the candle for the market lantern, and they both watched as each small flame made its first request of the evening air. The blue pane deepened to a calm pool. The white piece caught the breath and sent it back. The clear piece gave a thin ladder for light to climb. The green made a leaf where there was none. People at the tables stopped their talk in the middle of sentences to watch and then resumed with a small change in the shape of their voices. Someone placed a hand on another person's wrist without thinking. A child drew a circle and colored it with a yellow crayon until the paper almost shone. A pair of travelers near the door looked at the lanterns and then at the board and wrote "thank you" without a reason. The owner wiped the counter as if polishing a memory into it and set 2 cups on the end with steam practicing its line toward the ceiling. They stood for a time and let the lights do the work. When the room had taken the glow into itself, they stepped outside and carried the greenhouse lantern back up the hill. On the way, Aiden thought about the year closing like a book with a ribbon tucked between the pages to mark the place where they would begin again. He realized that the promise he felt tonight did not need words because it lived in the way their hands worked near each other without knocking, in the way their steps matched on the path, in the way the town had learned to expect the sight of them side by side without remark. In the greenhouse, they set the lantern on the bench, turned down the lamps, and watched the pieces show their character. The bubble in the aqua piece looked like a held breath just before a kind confession. The white felt like foam along the edge of sleep. The clear piece made a small square on the wall where the cutting's shadow could sit. They brewed a final tea and opened the honey. He dipped the spoon and let one slow thread fall into her cup and one into his, then put the lid back with the care of a person folding a letter. They sat and the room gave them its full attention. Around them the town prepared for midnight. The clock in the square practiced a little before it spoke the hour. In a house near the pier someone tuned a guitar with a cautious hand. Along the lane below the hill a group of friends passed with lanterns of their own and a basket with warm bread for a neighbor. Aiden reached into his sketchbook and took out a small blank card and began to write a note he would place on the cafe board in the morning. It said simply, "The lanterns learned how to speak tonight and we listened," and then he added, "Thank you for holding us while we waited," because he could not think of the last night at the station without feeling the weight of gratitude like a comfortable coat. Mira watched his hand moving and smiled, and then stood to check the small hooks once more and to brush a fingertip over the knots to feel their confidence. She touched the cutting with the back of her knuckle and felt the water cool and clean and saw the roots float like thin threads ready to braid. She did not say the thing in her chest because it did not need to be spoken to keep its shape. Yet she knew that the warmth of the room and the patience of the evening and the quiet rhythm of their work had all agreed that tomorrow would meet them with the same steady kindness. Midnight arrived without trumpets. The lantern light rounded its brightness and held it, the way a candle holds a prayer in a silent room. The clock in the square counted 12 in a voice that did not hurry. In the pause after the last tone, the town breathed in and then out and decided to rest. Aiden looked at Mira and she looked at him, and they both kept their voices low because it felt right to treat the hour like a sleeping child. He lifted his cup a little and she lifted hers and they drank. And then he stood and placed his palm against the warm wood of the bench and said that every part of the day had felt like a promise wrapped in simple paper. She nodded and set her hand over his for a moment and left it there long enough for the message to travel. Outside, the stars looked close enough to pick, but they left them where they were. The sea lay in the dark like a page waiting for morning to write on it. In the greenhouse, the lantern pieces settled into a slow, friendly motion that matched the breath of sleeping leaves. They blew out the smallest of the working lamps and left the rest to glow. And when they stepped out and locked the door, the panes shone in soft squares that made the hill look like a handful of small hearths scattered in the grass. They walked down to the lane and back to the square and paused at the cafe window one last time. The owner had left the market lantern to burn low and then fade by itself, with care taken to keep everything safe as always. And now the blue pane kept only a memory of flame and seemed content. They took the long way home on purpose so the year could close its last fold around them while they moved. When they reached the corner where they usually parted, the cold pressed politely at their coats and the air smelled like bread cooling and snow thinking. And they stood for a moment without words because they had learned how to speak with presence. Then they went their separate short paths with the same small tilt of the head they used when planning everything together. And the town kept them, and the sea breathed for them, and the lanterns held the lesson of the day in steady glass until morning returned and